Brexit negotiations continue to dominate commentary around the British economy. However, sterling is now at levels not seen since the UK's EU referendum back in June 2016 against both the dollar and the yen, and both the FTSE 100 and the 250 indices continue to hit record highs. How are things looking, and where are we on the path to Brexit? John Rowland is from Cicero Group and he joins us now. John, welcome. We've spoken to you before about your Brexometer. We'll get onto that in just a minute. What of general commentary, first of all, as to how you see things progressing? Because we spoke earlier in 2017 when we were in fairly fresh negotiations. Here we are now with some standards that have been laid out by both sides.
Yeah, I think that's right. The Prime Minister's Florence speech put us on a path which I think cleared things up a lot. And then you got to the end of the Phase 1 negotiations or the sufficient progress in December. And at that point, I think you see a lot more clarity about where the UK is going. One of the most intriguing things I think we see is what the impact is of all this agreement on the Irish border. Yeah.
Well, on that point, let's bring up your graphic, because I think this describes a lot of what's going on. When we last spoke to you, I think the barometer or the whatever you like to look at it, the pointer was further to the right, in other words, further towards the orange. Here we are now in the middle of the yellow. The black one is the government position, and the blue one is the momentum on this. Explain what this is considering, and what you talk about Florence, but we've got a number of other factors to consider.
So what we're considering here is what is the government's position and where does that place it on this spectrum between a totally hard WTO Brexit and remaining in the EU. Now, the Florence speech puts a set of parameters around what that looks like. So that means leaving the customs union, leaving the single market, leaving the jurisdiction of the ECJ. But since then, we've got some more colour on what precisely that looks like. And I think the tone of the discussion from the government has become softer and slightly warmer. So, for example, you see this language saying that that there will be full regulatory alignment, if that's necessary, in Northern Ireland to facilitate North-South cooperation. Now, that sounds like a mouthful, but what it says is that the UK is prepared to keep the status quo going beyond even a transition if that means that we get a slightly less bumpy ride. I think that's quite interesting. And the second part of it is the momentum, what we call the Brexit momentum, and that's generally what's going on in Parliament, because as the process has gone on, the Parliament has taken more control, as it were, over the process. So, for example, now we will have a meaningful vote on the withdrawal agreement. Now, the more that Parliament gets influence on this, I think the more the government will have to give pragmatic compromises here and there to Parliament in order to get a deal signed off. So I think those are two interesting developments.
But doesn't it take us further away from what people perceive is the will of the people, because the majority of MPs we know have nailed their colours to the mast, and they're saying they don't want this at all.
Well, yeah, I think to be fair, I mean, the version of Brexit which Theresa May set out in Florence is still a pretty hard Brexit. You know, there's no sense that we're going to remain in the single market here. So I think what the UK is going to be is broadly a sovereign country ploughing its own furrow, but with as much cooperation as we can get away with without being in the single market and contributing. So I think you shouldn't misread this as saying, you know, the UK is compromised on Brexit. The Brexit I see happening is still, you know, a fairly hard Brexit.
On your most recent release, you talk about the Irish border issue softening the UK position. You referred to this a short while ago in the interview. To what degree is Ireland at the centre of everything?
It's completely at the centre, because every single issue and problem that needs to be solved in Brexit you find in the North-South issue, plus a whole extra layer of political issues layered in as well. So that is what I sometimes call a kind of a laboratory for all of the Brexit issues. It's the only land frontier. You have the history of the Troubles there, the issue about unification. All of these things come together in Ireland, and I think the one thing that everybody agrees on is they don't want to mess it up, that nobody wants to upset the political stability of Ireland, and therefore extraordinary solutions will be found in order to keep that place stable and doing well. And if you can make compromises on North-South issues, it also gives you a sense of what might be possible for the wider UK relationship with the EU.
But the problem is it brings into the question about whether or not the ECJ has any involvement cross-border, which, according to Brexiteers, it should not. Customs union, as we discussed, is something where a soft border is going to implicate the UK into the customs union, which it can't. The trade deals, I mean, the whole thing doesn't seem to point to anything other than a hard border.
That rather depends on whether this classic European phrase of imagination can be used. So the UK has said, look, we can't accept the ECJ jurisdiction, but that doesn't mean that you can't have some form of other arbitration court set up under treaty. I think in the case of Ireland, there would be political will to find another solution which both sides can sign up to, which is independent, which has credibility, but doesn't involve the ECJ. And I think that is simply because Ireland is just this really special case.
Do you see another referendum coming to the people? I mean, as opposed to a parliamentary vote on the outcome, do you see something coming back to the people?
I don't see that as a particularly high likelihood, frankly. I think what's happened is that the discussion has moved a long way, but the polls haven't really moved much. There doesn't appear to be much of a groundswell of support amongst the polling and the British people for a second referendum. I think what we've got to now is a situation where most people just want it to get delivered. Now, there are a certain set of circumstances where if a government loses confidence, you could see a situation where they feel that they have to put a deal to the people. But I think what's happening in the process that we're seeing now is that Parliament would really be the arbiter of the deal and decide whether to sign that off or not.
Yeah. OK, so what are we up against now from this point on in January? As you say, it's just over a year to go until the March deadline. What are the next hurdles to clear?
So the next hurdle from the UK side is that the Cabinet needs to agree a strategy and a set of positions for the way forward. Broadly, what it wants is somewhere between minimal cooperation and maximum freedom and maximum cooperation and being kind of tied to the EU's direction. There are two camps in Cabinet there. What will happen is those two sides will have to thrash it out. There will then be a common position of sorts, which we think the Prime Minister will probably communicate in a speech a bit like Florence, again, maybe in February. And then the UK will go into negotiations in earnest for the future relationship.
But that's not likely to conclude, is it, by March 2019?
No. So what will happen is that the withdrawal agreement will that's effectively the divorce will be agreed by then, and then you might have heads of terms on what a future relationship might look like, but you probably need at least the 2 years of a transition to come to a final future relationship.
You talk about the potential transition period after March 2019. At that point, are we technically in or outside the EU?
We're out. There's no doubt about that. We're out, but it might feel very much like we're still in. What will happen is that we will still be implementing the rules. The new rules that come down the road will probably end up implementing. This isn't agreed yet, but this is likely to be what happens. And we'll be paying into the EU budget. We've pretty much promised that we're going to do that already. So in all senses, the way that you go about life, it might feel like we're in the EU, but actually we won't be in the EU anymore. Where it will really change is at the end of that transitional period, and we're moving to a new relationship.
OK, all right. So, John, thanks so much indeed for updating us on the Brexometer from Cicero Group. That's John Rowland joining us with an update on how things are going in terms of Brexit negotiations. Subscribe to IG for educational content, company insight, financial analysis and expert commentary.